A lot is happening in Ukraine. In just a few days, Ukraine has taken back more territory than Russia has taken in the last many months. Frankly, it looks like a nightmare scenario for Russia. So Putin is under increasing pressure, both because it's hard to see what he can do to turn things around, but also because he's gradually losing control over the narrative about this so-called special military operation. And that's what I want to talk about in this video. As you can probably tell, I'm not in my usual studio. I'm traveling and I was not planning on making any videos, but really, how could I not comment on the things that are happening? So here is a sort of improvised format from a hotel room in Germany. So it's not going to be as polished as usual, but I thought I could share some quick thoughts about something that is happening. So here are some thoughts on the fact that we are hearing more and more voices from inside Russia that are suddenly criticizing Putin and the military leadership in a way that is different from before. Because this really is the kind of thing that can bring down a dictatorship. So the situation is serious for Putin. But first, let me just sum up what happened. Over the last week, Ukraine has conducted incredibly successful counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. We can see it here on a deep state map. This is very simplified because obviously the real operations were much more complicated. But it gives a general idea. So on Monday, the 5th of September, this was the situation. There were a lot of Russian soldiers here in the Izium area. But then look what happened. First, Ukraine captured the city of Balaklia, and over a few days, that expanded into this deep attack toward Kupiansk. And because of the lake here, that meant that all the Russian forces in Izium were in risk of being encircled. So they started to retreat, and we don't know how many of them that got away and how many of them that have been taken as prisoners of war. And this was not some kind of orderly retreat. It was an absolute collapse of the Russian forces in this area. And the big question is, of course, whether Ukraine can continue further into Luhansk Oblast, which is over here, or maybe they can do something similar in Donetsk down here. So to stop this accident, Russia has taken all their forces from the northern part of Kharkiv Oblast and transferred them over here. The way the Russian Ministry of Defense has handled this has not been particularly convincing. When the Ukrainian attacks began, the first message was that Russia is moving reinforcements into the area. And they showed images on TV of military equipment that supposedly was moving in to meet the Ukrainian attacks. And then literally the next day, the message was exactly the opposite. That they had decided to pull all forces from the Izium area to reinforce the front line down in Donetsk. So for the Russian soldiers fighting in Izium, first they're told that help is on its way, and then they're told that no, actually not. Help is not coming, and that they're on their own. This has to be an incredibly demoralizing message for all the Russian soldiers on the front line, that if they are in trouble, then they're basically on their own. And also that they can't trust the things that they're told by the Ministry of Defense. And to make matters worse, when Izium was falling and while the Russian efforts were basically collapsing, then Putin apparently had more important things on his mind, because he was celebrating the 875th birthday of the city of Moscow, and he opened a new Ferris wheel. And the message from the Kremlin is also still that this special military operation is basically progressing according to plans. But the lies are becoming too obvious. And here's the thing, the real threat to Putin is not the liberals in Russia who are against the war, because they have been in opposition to Putin the whole time and he knows how to handle them. Now the real threat comes from two other sources. The first one is the ultranationalists. these are people who are not against the war, but who want more war. Like they share Putin's ideas about the place of Ukraine in the world. Like they fully believe that Ukraine and Russia is really one nation, and that Ukrainian nationalism is a disease that has to be exterminated by force. So their criticism is that Putin is not doing enough, that this special military operation is insufficient, and that Putin should declare full mobilization. Like these ultranationalists are largely represented by those Russian military bloggers that have become quite famous during the war. Like the most famous one is probably Igor Girkin. And these bloggers make sometimes some very good military analysis, and they clearly also have a network of sources that provide information about the situation on the front lines. And we also know that their views are shared by many of the soldiers. For example, there have been studies that show that these ultranationalist views are pretty common in Spetsnaz units, for example. And these ultranationalist voices are a real challenge for the Putin regime, because obviously he can't dismiss them as being sort of unpatriotic or foreign agents or something like that. And what is happening now is that these ultranationalists are turning against Putin. And that is dangerous for him, because it was one thing to be criticized for not making a big enough war or to have limited goals. Like that was manageable for Putin because most Russians would agree with his line, and the ultranationalists also still supported sort of the general idea about the need for a military solution in Ukraine. But what's happening now is that a dichotomy is sort of being created between Putin and the troops. So it used to be that if you are a patriot and you support Russia and you support our troops, then you also have to support Putin, who is leading these efforts. But now the logic is changing. Increasingly, the message is that if you support our troops, then you have to be critical of that commander-in-chief who put them in this situation and now is abandoning them. That the patriotic thing to do suddenly is to be against Putin and to criticize his mistakes. And this changing narrative is driven by these ultranationalist voices in Russia. And that leads to the other group, which is a threat to Putin. And that is the very large part of the Russian population that is essentially apolitical, like those who don't care. I made an interview with Brian Taylor some time back, and he said that one of Putin's big problems is that he basically spent 20 years doing everything he could to demobilize the population, like to make them disinterested in politics. And an important ingredient in keeping people disinterested is that they don't feel a moral obligation to show any kind of interest. And that is why it's a problem for Putin that the lies from the Ministry of Defense now have to be so obvious. Because in combination with the criticism from the ultranationalists, this can create a sense of moral obligation to show sort of an interest in politics. That if you are a true patriot, then you have to side with the troops, those troops that Putin has sent to Ukraine. And it doesn't really matter like what you personally think the solution should be. Like some people would support the ultranationalists and say that Russia should send more soldiers to Ukraine, and others would sort of side with the liberals and say that the war as a whole is a tragedy that has to end. Like it really doesn't matter what people choose. The important thing is that this is a topic that could mobilize the population, and that both sides would agree, basically, that Putin needs to go. So that is why it's so dangerous for Putin, that there is this criticism from the military bloggers, and that the Ministry of Defense now has to lie so blatantly that people can't even pretend to believe them. Like, because this can set a direction where being a true Russian patriot no longer means that you also automatically support Putin, but rather that you demand his resignation. Okay, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching this somewhat improvised video. I look forward to seeing you again next time.